Tonight on Nation to Nation, the government has tabled a new UNDRIP bill. Its goal is to affirm the rights of Indigenous people in federal law.
And there's also a process requirement that will require us really to work with Indigenous leadership across Canada.
But the critic for Crown Indigenous Relations says not so fast. Conservative Kathy McLeod says the bill lacks clarity.
So the government would appear to have moved forward in a symbolic way, but not in a measurable way.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamourant, and welcome to Nation to Nation. The federal government recently tabled a new bill, C-15. It's also called the UNDRIP bill. That's the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's not the first time, however, that an UNDRIP bill has been tabled in the House of Commons. Former NDP MP Romeo Saganash was unable to pass his own private member's bill before retiring from politics. But this bill was tabled by the Liberal minority government. So will it have support? And what does the bill actually mean? To discuss all that, I'm now joined by Justice Minister and the Attorney General of Canada, David Lametti. Welcome to Nation to Nation, Minister Lametti.
Pleased to be here, Todd.
So how does this version of the UNDRIP bill differ from Saganash's bill?
Well, it is, Saganash's bill served as a base. I mean, what Romeo did was very, very good, and it was a great start. It almost made it past the finish line in the Senate, but stalling by Conservative senators ended up killing it. What we have done is enhance the bill just to make it a bit more clear. Again, working with Indigenous leadership across Canada, we looked to where we could make quick improvements to the bill. And that's the bill that we have now put forward. As a government bill, as you know, it's a bit easier for us to have control of the levers that hopefully will allow it to get through. So both the House of Commons and then later in the Senate will have to give this bill priority as a government bill when it gets there, as opposed to a private member's bill, which they could just leave sitting on the order paper.
By affirming UNDRIP applies in federal law, how would we actually see that unfold? Could you give us a concrete example?
Well, I think in very real terms, future federal law will have to be aligned with the principles that are contained in UNDRIP. We've already done this with respect to C-91, the Indigenous Languages Act, and C-92, the Indigenous Child Welfare Act. Both of those were drafted with UNDRIP in view. Anything that we do going forward will have to be, drafted. And there's also a process requirement that will require us really to work with Indigenous leadership across Canada and particular nations in a number of different cases, depending on the kind of policy that's involved or the kind of legislation that's involved, simply because that's the underlying spirit of UNDRIP. It's about cooperation, collaboration. It's about working together to create policy and about working together to create law.
Now, there's a lot of confusion out there, especially amongst grassroots people, about how will this legislation affect me? I mean, how is it going to affect the day-to-day lives of Indigenous people?
I really do believe that it will help change attitudes. It's particularly important to young people, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, that we get this relationship right. And I think much of what UNDRIP does is creates the right kinds of attitudes, the right kind of spirit of cooperation and collaboration, which frankly, look, over 150 years of over 150 years of colonial history, we have not had, and it helps us really begin to dismantle that colonial history piece by piece.
Now, just recently, the Assembly of First Nations had its annual Chiefs meeting, virtually, of course, and a lot of Chiefs were not supportive of this UNDRIP bill. I mean, what do you say to those leaders that are not on board yet?
Well, first of all, I would say with a smile that I would probably be a fool to walk into First Nation politics. But look, I understand on a more substantive note. I understand the reticence. I understand some of the critiques. We have been working with Indigenous leadership at a variety of different levels across Canada, quite intensively for the past little while, and we're going to continue to do that. We're going to continue to consult where we can with not just national Indigenous groups, but regional Indigenous leadership groups, as well as nations, in order to really hear the concerns. There are so many particularities to the situation of First Nations, of Inuit and of Métis across Canada, that everyone brings their own point of view to the document. Everyone brings their own point of view to the process. And so it really is just going to take the time that it takes to reach out, to speak, to establish the kinds of dialogues that we need to establish. And so I understand that there is resistance, and that's normal. It's a new document. It is a complex process in a very historically complex situation, which has been fraught with injustice, quite frankly. And so we, as I said, step by step, will continue to work with good faith. We'll continue to speak to the people not only who agree with it, but to the people who disagree with it, and we will continue working from there.
Now, a lot of critics, certainly from the Conservative Party, say this bill will provide First Nations, Inuit, or Métis communities with the ability to veto resource development. How do you respond to those criticisms?
Well, I think there has been, first of all, I think what the document does, most importantly, is create the groundwork for a process, for a real meaningful consultative process between Indigenous nations and resource developers and provincial governments and federal governments, whoever is involved in the process. And it forces meaningful dialogue and meaningful contact. And that will result at the end of the day in better projects. We had Indigenous leadership groups of all sorts telling us that was not only the only way to move forward, but also the way to move forward to create better projects, fairer projects, projects that actually benefited Indigenous nations. So whether they be First Nations, Inuit, or Métis, and I think that's right. Does it mean it's a veto? A number of Indigenous and non-Indigenous leaders have said that it doesn't mean it's a veto, but the very process itself of meaningful consultation will ensure that there is a large degree of consensus as in order for projects to move forward, and so. It's virtually impossible to say that it is or isn't. Certainly in my view, it doesn't constitute a veto, but the better process means we'll get to a better place in virtually every case.
What if that better place is that the First Nation or the nation whose territory might be affected by resource development just says no? Can they not say no and not have the Minister of Resources, for example, override that no?
Well, I don't think you can answer that question in the abstract. I think you have to say you have to wait until the kinds of situations happen and work themselves through. As I said, the point of UNDRIP is about process. The point of UNDRIP is about meaningful consultation, meaningful dialogue. And it's also about self-government and self-determination for Indigenous peoples as a starting point. And so this is, I think those underlying principles will get us to better results. And, it's impossible for me to speculate on individual cases, but I'm pretty confident that there's a lot of good faith in both the Indigenous and non-Indigenous leadership groups in any particular case that we will get to yes.
The Conservative Party, of course, has said this bill, along with Romeo Saganash's private members bill, lacks clarity. How will you get that clarity? How willing is your government to compromise to get this particular legislation passed?
Well, I note that the House of Commons passed Romeo Saganash's bill last time. The UN Declaration has been around for a long time. It was drafted in large part by Indigenous leaders around the world, including great Canadian Indigenous leaders such as Dr. Willie Littlechild. And The document's been here. The document's been around for 20 years. The bill, Romeo's bill, has been around for 4 years. This bill hasn't been around as long, but is very similar to Romeo's. I firmly believe that there is enough clarity in this bill to move forward. It's about establishing a process. The bill, as we have drafted it, forces us to create an action plan moving forward within a relatively short period of time, in collaboration and consultation with Indigenous leadership. I think, to me, that's pretty clear. I can give you examples of other legislation that we've passed in other areas that's a lot less clear than this. I think those are just excuses on the part of the Conservatives. They're looking, even though the irony, of course, is Willie Littlechild was a Conservative MP for part of his wonderful history. I think they're just looking for excuses. This is a positive bill moving forward. This is positive for Indigenous peoples in Canada. This is positive for non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. And I think finally, as Willie Littlechild said, we're standing at the starting line, but we're going to run the race together this time.
Finally, Minister Lametti, I just want to switch gears and talk about a court order that has given you permission to destroy person of interest records that allege abuse in the St. Anne's residential school. Now, NDP MP Charlie Angus has asked that those records be preserved for ongoing legal battles. So what will your department be doing to those records?
Let me just say from the outset that the idea that's being advanced by Charlie Angus, that the government's intentionally trying to destroy records on ongoing matters before the courts, is utterly and completely incorrect. There was a Supreme Court of Canada ruling that was advanced by the survivors themselves, that they wanted to be able to destroy certain kinds of documents in certain cases to protect privacy and that sort of thing. This is from the survivors of the St. Anne's residential school themselves, and in particular certain documents pertaining to the independent assessment process. Now, obviously, there are a multitude of complicated legal cases in which those documents will play a role. And so we have to assess, as Attorney General, I can't say much more than that on what the government's position is in particular cases. But any suggestion that the government is trying to destroy these kinds of documents for ongoing matters is absolutely incorrect. We have to, in every case, try to figure out how to follow the ruling of the Supreme Court and how to protect the wishes of survivors of the St. Anne's School. And that's the direction in which we're going. We'll do that in good faith.
Okay, Minister Lametti, I want to thank you for speaking to me, and I'm sure I'll be talking to you again as Bill C-15 winds its way through Parliament.
It'll be my pleasure. Thank you.
Coming up after the break, Crown Indigenous Relations Shadow Minister Cathy McLeod will give the Conservative Party's view on Bill C-15. Welcome back. Cathy McLeod is the Shadow Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations for the Conservative Party. She's been a frequent guest on Nation to Nation in the past, and she's here now to talk about Bill C-15, the UNDRIP bill, something the federal Conservatives were critical of in its former incarnation as C-262. Ms. McLeod, welcome back to Nation.
My pleasure to join you.
I know that you've talked about it in the past in relation to Romeo Saganash's private member's bill, but what is the Conservative Party's number one concern with C-15?
I think the number one concern is the lack of clarity coming from British Columbia. I think people were very happy to see them legislate the UN Declaration, but of course now it's creating many, many challenges because there's expectations that aren't being met. And so the government would appear to have moved forward in a symbolic way, but not in a measurable way. So I think it's absolutely critical that there be lots of clarity around what it means, what it doesn't mean. And so I do want to also note that at the AFN last week, they did not give a motion to support this bill. So if the government is true to its words about free, prior, and informed consent, if they can't get the support of the chiefs at the AFN, then, I'm not sure that they're ready to move this bill forward.
When you talk about a lack of clarity, what do you think will happen if this bill goes through without clarity? What is the ramification? Is there something concrete you can talk about?
I think number one, they talked yesterday in British Columbia how you're going to have more court cases, not less court cases, cases to say what it means or doesn't mean. So, I think issues like free, prior, and informed consent need to have clarity. So, and again, I'll use an example. Some of the chiefs at the AFN were supportive of the legislation as proposed, but there was a number that weren't. And so it was tabled and it wasn't supported. So was that free, prior, and informed consent, or was it not having some of the chiefs support and not others? So how are we going to move forward on really important issues if we don't get clarity around who can speak, who can give informed consent, what is informed consent? Does it mean unanimity within the AFN, as an example? Those issues are, I think, really, really important to flesh out sooner rather than later.
Of course, when critics talk about informed consent, they're worried about a veto. And supporters of the bill say there is no veto in this legislation.
Yeah. They haven't used the word veto, but if you look at the words of the outgoing Murray Sinclair, essentially that was the words that he was using. If you look at Romeo Saginaw, the proponent of the bill, to him, free, prior, and informed consent was the right to say yes, the right to say no. And for an example with a pipeline, his example was every single First Nations along the pipeline had to give consent, had to say yes for a project to proceed. So that is, certainly they might not use the word veto, but if you look at the words of both Murray Sinclair, Senator Murray Sinclair, and the original proponent of the bill, consent has a meaning in law, and certainly it is about yes and it is about no.
Do you not foresee that some of these wrinkles can't be ironed out when it goes to committee and witnesses are called and it gets debated more in Parliament?
I think the government, first of all, to have put forward a piece of legislation that did not have the support of the chiefs. They said they were going to co-develop legislation, and have they lived up to their commitment with that one? So, certainly the Conservatives, see the UN Declaration as an incredibly important document. We've supported, the Indigenous language, the child welfare, the statutory holiday, changing the citizenship oath, the many, many different components of it. But it becomes very certainly complicated to do what they're doing right now, and again, without really the support of the chiefs who actually tabled the motion.
How do you see this legislation undermining reconciliation in the long run? I mean, would it not help reconciliation to pass this bill?
I think there's clarity, and if we end up like they suggested might have to happen in British Columbia with more court cases rather than less, I think any natural resource company now recognizes the some obligation have in terms of partner with First Nations in a meaningful way, and quite frankly, projects don't go ahead if that is not done. So in terms of, our natural resource projects, I think we're finally getting to the point where we're getting it right after too many years of not getting it right. But to add more complication, I think would be a real, to spend more times in court rather than doing things that are going to, help First Nations, Indigenous communities move forward in a positive way, I think is not to the benefit.
You, of course, listed a number of pieces of legislation that Conservatives did support. Are there any chances that changes can be made to C-15 that would allow for Conservative support?
Certainly we will express what our concerns are. It is a minority parliament. We will look for clarity. We will look for, one of our other concerns, and I think the Coastal GasLink was a good example in terms of the Wet'suwet'en and who makes decisions and who gets to provide informed consent. And so certainly, we know that communities and, the governance structures, the traditional governance structures were eroded. And we know that communities have to sort of get back to some more traditional ways and providing clarity within communities, because I certainly think, everyone can appreciate the Wet'suwet'en and how challenging that was.
I want to switch gears, talk about something else for a change, and that's Crown Indigenous relations. They've been fairly quiet on their action plan for the MMIWG report, but earlier this week they reiterated a commitment of $781 million over 5 years to combat violence against Indigenous women and girls and LGBTQ2 people. Your reaction?
We always welcome support for programs for violence against Indigenous women and girls. So the money is welcome. To me, what was more important is they promised an action plan. They haven't delivered on this action plan. So if you were going to have an action plan, you would think that within that plan, you would have priorities and that the money that you would be targeted towards the priorities. So what they've done is they said, okay, here's some money and we believe it's, it's important and we're going to provide. But shouldn't that money be funding the action plan that everyone has worked so hard on that they haven't actually finished, completed, and again, broken the promise in terms of when it would get out the door?
Other than that, how has Minister Carolyn Bennett been handling this portfolio so far this session?
I think, Minister Bennett has put in a lot of years in terms of this portfolio. And, I know that her heart is certainly in the right place in terms of wanting to move forward in a good way, which, I think is important. But I get worried about all the missed deadlines, whether, it was Minister Miller and the drinking water. I mean, they made a promise, and they made a promise about an action plan for murdered and missing, and they aren't delivering on, the promises. If you need to make if you're going to make a promise, you should be absolutely sure you're going to deliver. And again, it's just more broken promises, which I think doesn't do good for the relationships.
Okay, Ms. McLeod, I want to thank you again for joining us, and I hope to speak to you again sometime soon.
I'm sorry for the connection, but it's our world.
That's for sure. Thank you. Bye-bye now. After a short break, we'll have more. Welcome back. This was our final news show of 2020. I, for one, will be glad to see this year in the rearview mirror. So we'll be back in January, and things can only get better in the new year. But in the meantime, on behalf of myself and everyone who works on Nation to Nation, and that includes you, John Cook, we wait for a healthy return to the show. Have a safe and Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I'm Todd Lamoran. Thanks for watching.